Lecture 10, on Ethics, Contemporary Moral Problems. Business Ethics. 1. Introduction to Business Ethics. Our text opens this chapter with the question, what is a business? While this seems like a simple question with a straightforward answer, our text has us consider non-profits and fast food chains, and how different they are, challenging the simplicity of what exactly constitutes a business. For the sake of argument and analysis, our text proposes we begin from the claim that a business is an organization that buys and sells goods or services for profit. From that claim, we can see how ethical concerns emerge. Buying and selling requires interactions between people, thereby creating types of relationships. Anytime there are interactions between people, there is the question, how ought people interact with one another? In business, there are many types of relationships, and, in each, we can ask ethical questions regarding how people ought to interact with one another. The first relationship our text would have us consider is that of a business to its shareholders. Is there something morally wrong with shareholders cutting employee wages to increase their profit? It is their business, so who can say what they can and can't do with it? The second relationship example examined is that of a business to its customers. Would it be immoral to deceive customers to increase profit? The relationship between a business and its employees is also considered. Are there moral implications to reducing employee benefits to save money or opportunistically suing a company when you can leverage some kind of accusation against it? The relationship between business and the environment is an all too familiar example. Factories regularly pollute our air and oil companies often devastate our oceans. Our text also points out that companies these days display values in multiple ways. For example, a phrase that is often used in this context is a business's corporate social responsibility, or CSR, and we can take CSR to mean a business approach that contributes to sustainable development by delivering economic, social, and environmental benefits for all stakeholders. Companies will also take moral stances with political implications, such as Nike's endorsement of Colin Kaepernick after kneeling during the national anthem. Our text entertains a challenge to whether ethics and business are at all rationally compatible. After all, if the whole point is to make money, then why let any other principle guide your actions? Our text sets out an argument that challenges business ethics conceptually as a whole, namely: 1. A business's aim is to make a profit. 2. A business will make a profit if it can attract customers. 3. In the present context, at least in the West, a business will attract most customers if it appears to be ethical. 4. It will make more profit if it appears ethical rather than actually being ethical, because it actually costs more to be ethical rather than simply appearing ethical. Therefore, according to this argument, businesses ought to try to appear ethical, rather than actually be ethical. This may very well be how things actually are. Indeed, we seem to expect some level of corruption, or sleazy business practices, within companies, and when they are revealed to the public, not many are surprised. However, the potential cost of being found out when feigning ethics may be enough for some businesses to bite the bullet and adopt ethical business practices. For example, a YouTuber, Kevin David, was recently fined over $52 million for scamming customers with get-rich-quick courses. Now, after years of fraud and living a lavish lifestyle, Kevin David may be flat broke. With examples such as this, it is an open question as to how many businesses are actually ethical and how many fake it as a marketing tactic. 2. Employers and employees. This section of our text opens with an account of a company's rapid rise to the top of the United Kingdom's sports retail industry. Sports Direct was on a rapid rise from 1992 to 2016 when it was revealed that they had been underpaying and horribly mistreating their employees. However, no one was stopping employees from quitting, and everyone who worked there applied to do so willingly. So, legality aside, what is our justification for the claim that what they were doing was morally wrong? When we examine this problem through Bentham's Act utilitarian lens, it's hard to find a way to justify this moral claim. After all, underpaying a few thousand employees to benefit millions of customers, on this view, appears to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. However, if we switch lenses to Mills, even as utilitarians we may still argue that Sports Direct conducted business unethically. Recall that Mill endorsed a qualitative view of utility, that is, not all pains and pleasures are equal, as the earlier hedonic calculus appeared to suggest. Therefore, we have grounds to argue that the disrespect endured by the thousands of employees outweighed the minor pleasures it afforded millions in the form of cheap running shoes. Furthermore, since Mill's view is a rule utilitarian view, it can challenge Sports Direct further, since the rule, companies ought to treat their employees fairly, would cause greater good for a greater number of people than would be created by rejecting that rule. When our text changes lenses again to view this issue from a Kantian perspective, our authors limit their analysis to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, since the objection that the company was treating its employees as mere means to ends, and not as ends in and of themselves, may appear the most obvious. However, as our text points out in Chapter 2, this is no longer problematic when we are also treating people as rational and free. If you use someone to fix your sink by paying them, and they freely and rationally chose to become a plumber for hire, then you are treating them as rational and free beings, and your use of them is moral and mutually beneficial. Therefore, for the Sports Direct example to be immoral, we would need case-by-case context. If a majority of their workforce couldn't survive without that specific job, either from lack of qualification for, or availability of, other job opportunities, then the company could be viewed as exploiting those employees. However, this question needs to be answered before we can paint the entirety of the company's relationships with the same Kantian brush. Even though our authors elect to save the first formulation of the categorical imperative for later, it is worthwhile for the sake of practice to apply it here anyway. Applying the first formulation to this example is particularly difficult, since it is not clear what it would look like if the maxim, always mistreat and underpay your employees, was universalized. Would we reject all forms of employment and revert back to a hunter-gatherer society? Would the world be run exclusively using slave labor? Or, troublingly, would the world look exactly as it does today in reality? Does the world, as it currently is, look like all businesses are following the maxim, always mistreat and underpay your employees? Perhaps so, perhaps not, but this will depend on your experience of the world so far. However you've answered any of these questions, there is still the further question you must ask yourself to find an answer using the Kantian ethical lens, namely, do your answers to these questions expose some contradiction? If so, then you have reason to believe, at least according to Kantian ethics, that the opposite maxim, namely, never mistreat or underpay your employees, is a moral imperative. 3. Businesses and customers. What responsibilities, if any, do companies owe to their customers? Honesty, integrity, quality products. One would hope, but does that mean companies should include common-sense dissuasions in their advertisements? Should Apple advertise that the difference between iPhones and Androids has become so narrow that if you elect to spend more on an iPhone, the extra cost is merely for the logo? Should designer labels admit that you've been brainwashed into believing that their products are of higher quality than less expensive brands? Should jewelry stores admit that any diamonds you purchase new are worth 40 to 80% less than you are paying? Or ought they just let you find out on your own that, should you ever try to sell that rare stone, encrusted gold band, only to find that it, in reality, only possesses a fraction of the value that the public has been brought to believe it possesses through advertising? Indeed, as our text says, businesses can and often do directly affect how we perceive goods, services, the world around us, our perceptions of value, and our very selves through advertising. The effectiveness of advertising is so powerful that, many times, otherwise rational people will ignore the fact that they are paying substantially more for something that has little value. Our text claims that this puts businesses in positions of trust related to their customers. This may be the case, but does anyone really believe that Apple, Gucci, or Louis Vuitton would never take advantage of us? Let's say for the sake of discussion that businesses are in a position of trust. Since it would not be in a business's interest to give the pros and cons of their goods and services, perhaps all they owe their customers is an honest account of the pros. Our text draws a distinction between withholding information and lying. While the former could just be an instance of minding one's own business or simply remaining silent, the latter is intentional deception. Perhaps lying when you are in a position of trust crosses the line and business ought not to do so. However, on what grounds can we make this claim? It seems the utilitarian would be in the same boat as last time, namely, if lying produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people, in that case, lying could not be claimed to be immoral. From the Kantian perspective, however, it is never morally acceptable for a business to lie to customers while in a position of trust because, according to the first formulation of the categorical imperative, if all businesses acted in accordance with the maxim, lie to customers while in a position of trust, the position of trust would disappear because no one would trust businesses. This is a self-defeating contradiction, which indicates to the Kantian that the opposite maxim must be a moral law, namely, never lie to customers while in a position of trust. And of course, this fails the second formulation of the categorical imperative also, since lying to manipulate customers doesn't respect them as rational beings, thus using them instead as means to ends, not treating them as ends in and of themselves. 4. Business and the environment. As our text says, since globalization, we can see that the world is not the vast, indestructible object with limitless resources we once thought it to be. With advancements in science, we've learned of the delicate balance required for some species to survive, and we can see the interdependence between species in ecosystems. While our text notes some difficulties in attempting to apply the utilitarian and Kantian ethical theories to pollution in thought experiments, it is important to think beyond the text and see if we can come up with more, and possibly different, results. If we recall what our text had to say about utilitarianism in the cyanide contamination example, we can see that the immediate application of the theory is problematic since, on this view, environmental rights are unfounded and the plants and animals that died do not experience the pleasures or happiness required for them to fit within the utilitarian's moral calculus. Similarly, the Kantian theory, on the face of things, is difficult to apply since it only recognizes moral obligations to rational agents, which the environment and animals are not. Where our text leaves this topic, there is no immediate and clear application for either of these theories to answer the question, why is it morally wrong for businesses to damage the environment? However, if we take a different approach from that of our text, which focused on individual instances of businesses harming the environment and instead consider the large-scale implications of pollution, these ethical theories may no longer be silent. For example, every accredited scientific institution agrees on 3 things: 1. Climate change is real, 2. Humans are contributing to it, and 3. It is among the greatest threats to the survival of humanity. What would it look like if all businesses operated with complete disregard for the environmental implications of their procedures? For an idea, consider these statements from the U.S. Embassy in Georgia and former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. The People's Republic of China, the PRC, is the world's leading annual emitter of greenhouse gases and mercury. This noxious air pollution threatens China's people, as well as global health and the world's economy. An estimated 1.24 million people died from exposure to air pollution in the PRC in 2017, according to a recent study in the medical journal The Lancet. Since 2000, the number of people who have died from air pollution in the PRC tops 30 million, according to New Scientist magazine. Too much of the Chinese Communist Party's economy is built on willful disregard for air, land, and water quality. The Chinese people, and the world, deserve better. If every business in every country behaved in this way, all of the world's inhabitants would be suffering in similar, if not far worse ways as those in China, who are dying by the millions every year as a result. Since humanity includes everyone, the utilitarian can re-enter the discussion regarding businesses polluting the environment, because doing good for everyone is doing good for the greatest number of people. Similarly, the Kantian ethicist can also re-enter the discussion because now, it is not merely the plants and animals that are threatened, but all of the rational human life on the planet. Therefore, the Kantian can conclude that the maxim, businesses should never pollute the environment, is a moral law. An Aristotelian can also conclude that it is unwise and rash to ignore the threat of climate change, given the severity of the situation. In the fight against climate change, from the Aristotelian point of view, someone who does not combat climate change because they are afraid of the difficulty of the undertaking, would suffer from the defect vice of cowardice, while someone else who ignored climate change out of arrogant species chauvinism would suffer from the excess vice of rash foolhardiness. However, one who recognizes the threat and takes up the challenge to combat climate change enjoys both wisdom and the golden mean virtue of courage. 5. Business and globalization. In this section, our text examines some difficulties we encounter when we attempt to apply Western moral standards in different parts of the global community. The first example is child labor. In the West, we condemn large companies like Nike, Gap, and Walmart for using child labor in developing countries. However, when we learn that the people of those countries are grateful for the opportunity for their children to work to help improve the lives of their families, and that they see it as a good thing, how should that impact our moral calculus from a utilitarian, Kantian, or Aristotelian perspective? Our text also considers the West's potential hypocrisy in imposing, often expensive, Western environmental standards on developing countries that are just beginning their own industrial revolutions. There was no one around, or qualified, to challenge Western countries' industrial development, but now that other countries want to do as the West did, the West steps in to tell them it is immoral. In agreement with our text, I will leave it to you to analyze these potential moral problems using the ethical lenses we've collected during the normative ethics portion of our text, primarily utilitarianism, Kantian ethics, Aristotelian virtue ethics, and natural law theory. 6. Summary. Our text concludes, the label, business ethics, is relatively new. The customer is now very sensitive to how ethical a business is, and thus any signs of moral wrongdoing by a business will lead to a slump in profits. This leads to a general question of whether there is any incentive to be, rather than simply appearing to be, ethical. One question that we have not yet addressed is whether capitalism, the environment needed for businesses to exist, is itself immoral. Marx, and many others, certainly thought that a system that leads us to seek after more money and more material goods will crush and stunt human flourishing. If our function as humans involves devoting time to being healthy, being with friends and family, developing hobbies and skills, educating ourselves, etc., then the for-profit mentality of capitalism could be seen as not allowing us to fulfill this role. The essence of capitalism is to turn nature into commodities and commodities into capital. The live green earth is transformed into dead gold bricks, with luxury items for the few and toxic slag heaps for the many. The glittering mansion overlooks a vast sprawl of shanty towns, wherein a desperate, demoralized humanity is kept in line with drugs, television, and armed force. Perhaps then the most ethical response to business is to refuse to play the capitalist game of business in the first place and to rethink what business might mean and how a business should act. 7. Questions and tasks. While our text asks 12 very interesting questions, please at least answer the following before next time. 1. What do you think of the argument that it is irrational for a business to be ethical? 2. Find a few examples of adverts. Explain in your own words what they are telling the customer. Is this intentional deception? Is it lying? 3. Why should businesses care about the world they leave for future generations? After all, future generations do not exist. 4. If you do think that capitalism is immoral, then what alternative is there? Why is the proposed alternative more morally acceptable?